Castañeda, Southeast Asia Engagement Lead for Climate and Energy for the World Resources Institute, or WRI. And I am excited to host today's webinar, especially as we have been able to assemble the best possible set of panelists and speakers for such a timely and impactful virtual event. Next slide, please. For the benefit of those who can't be able to join us today, this webinar will be recorded. We will also be sending the link of the recording along with the key takeaways over the next few days. Today, we will be discussing how we can ensure this balancing act we've been hearing for years. First, the growth and penetration of renewable energy in the Philippine grid. And second, the reliability of the grid, with a focus on the recently published report on the country's competitive renewable energy zones. After these brief introductions and context setting, Attorney Mona de Malanta of the National Renewable Energy Board will give her welcoming remarks, to be followed by a presentation on developing the competitive renewable energy zones to accelerate energy transition. We will also have an open forum, so please feel free to raise your questions in the Zoom Q&A box at any point during the webinar. Next slide, please. This webinar is brought to you by the National Renewable Energy Board alongside the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, or CEIA. CEIA is an innovative public-private partnership that addresses barriers to scale the deployment of clean energy solutions for commercial and industrial consumers in emerging markets like the Philippines. The CEIA is jointly led by the World Resources Institute, Alotro Partners, and the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, and supported by governments and other donors. Next slide, please. So for the first context setting slide, in our last webinar, where we tackled on leveraging cost-competitive renewable energy, we heard from the Department of Energy that the country is moving towards the direction which ensures flexibility and reliability. We also saw that renewable energy technologies are already cost-competitive with the LCOE, or levelized cost of electricity, of solar, wind, hydro, biomass, and geothermal, reaching costs much lower than traditional fossil fuel power plants. Next slide, please. In this slide, so please bear with me. In this slide, we can see the rates in the retail supply contracts, or RSC, of retail electricity suppliers under the RCOA, or the Retail Competition and Open Access, for the fourth quarter of 2019. The weighted average cost of generation by all RES participants was only 4.11 pesos per kilowatt hour. This is lower than the generation rate of the utility that's servicing Manila, which is at 4.82 pesos per kilowatt hour over the same period. We have also highlighted here some of the RES that's already providing 100% renewable energy. We can see that they're already offering rates lower than the weighted average cost. Next slide, please. We also highlighted the most recent auctions in October 2020 in Malaysia, our neighbor, which saw bids as low as 0.14 Malaysian ringgit per kilowatt hour, which is equivalent to 1.63 pesos per kilowatt hour. This auction, which was 9 times oversubscribed, was settled at the rate of around 2 pesos per kilowatt hour, but even the highest bid price at 2.80 pesos per kilowatt hour is still much lower than our average generation rate here in the Philippines. Next slide, please. In our last webinar, the National Renewable Energy Board stated that they plan to push for the DOE to hard code the goal of having 35% RE in the power mix by 2030. This entails an additional 40 terawatt hours, or equivalent to 20 gigawatts of renewable energy in the solar-driven scenario presented by AC Energy for this decade. We already have the RE policy mechanisms in place. The only thing we need now is for these policies to be fully implemented. Next slide, please. Mr. Eric Francia, President and CEO of AC Energy, proposed in our webinar last June that the country needs an additional 20 gigawatts of RE going into 2030. This solar-driven scenario, which takes into account the development time of various RE technologies, entails an additional 15 gigawatts of solar, 3 gigawatts of wind, 1 gigawatt of hydro, and 500 megawatts of geothermal and biomass plants to be developed in addition to 5 gigawatts of energy storage as a way to meet the 35% renewable energy target. Next slide, please. Here, I'll present the pervasiveness of the power of choice that is expected to hasten the energy transition. First Gen Corporation Vice President, Mr. Reman Chua, shared that the Green Energy Option Program and the eventual lowering of the ARCOA to household level would increase demand for low-cost power, which, as we saw, can now already be provided by renewable energy suppliers. There are 20 million consumers in the Philippines, and only 0.01%, or almost 2,000, are contestable or able to choose the source of electricity. The Green Energy Option Program, with its 100 kilowatt threshold, would open the market to thousands of MSME consumers looking for opportunities to cut down on operation costs through cheaper electricity. Now, with the clear directions from the DOE and rising consumer demand for RE, how do we ensure that the grid can take on this increase in RE capacity and usher this opportunity for 30 billion US dollars of potential investments by 2030? Next slide, please. The chairman of the Senate Committee on Energy and co-chair of the Joint Congressional Energy Commission, Senator Win Gatchalian, in a webinar hosted by the University of the Philippines Law Center last August 7th, shared the key elements towards an envisioned energy future. Modernizing our grid would ultimately require our grid infrastructure to be decarbonized, decentralized, and digitalized. In this webinar, we will hear from the experts from the National Grid Corporation and the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And joining in the panel are experts from the Department of Energy and the NGCP on their insights on how the Philippines can enable the energy transition through enhancements and modernization of the grid and ensure energy system resilience and handle the volatility from large-scale integration of distributed renewables. Next slide, please. Indeed, these are very insightful data and information to chew on, and we'll learn more about these from our very prominent speakers. In today's live webinar, we are joined by Attorney Mona Lisa de Malanta, Chairperson of the National Renewable Energy Board, who will be providing the welcoming remarks. We're also joined by the authors of the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones report from NREL, Dr. Nathan Lee and Dr. David Hurlbut, and with them are Engineer Nori Reyes, one of the key authors of the report representing our very own DOE. We will also have Engineer Reddy Remarosa to react on the presentation later. Next slide, please. So please feel free to raise additional and supporting questions on the Q&A box in Zoom at any time during the program, and we will do our best to raise them to our panelists. And we will also encourage you to share any insights you have in the chat box. And these are the key questions for today. How do we ensure that the identified CREZ locations are utilized? What is the timeline to develop further grid infrastructure, if any, for these areas? Given learnings we've heard from examples like in Hawaii, how do we move past concerns on grid stability and reliability with increased penetration of variable renewable energy and leverage on available cost-efficient technologies? And how can the country position itself as a regional destination for energy storage investments? Next slide, please. With that, I want to formally introduce Attorney Mona Lisa de Malanta as our first speaker. Attorney Mona is presently the chair of the Philippine National Renewable Energy Board, or NREB, and she's also a partner in PJS Law. and, until her assumption of office as NREB chair, led the energy group of the firm. She has recently been awarded International Financial Law Review, or IFLR, as one of the best lawyers in 2020. Attorney Mona Lisa is also recognized as one of this year's distinguished representatives of women in renewables Asia for her invaluable work in bringing and accelerating RE in the country. Attorney Mona, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Marlon. Good morning and good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga sa mga kasama natin dito sa Pilipinas. And good morning to our friends from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory who are joining us all the way from the US. So we are very grateful. I guess that's what we want to say at the outset. We are very grateful for them spending their evening with us because it's their evening. It's our work day. It's our work hours, but we appreciate truly that they are carving time out of their what should be already their rest hours to join us for this morning. So maybe what Marlon had set the context very nicely, and we are also grateful to Clean Energy Investment Accelerator for co-hosting the series with us. And when we were brainstorming this, maybe I can just share with you as an opening for our discussion this morning. When we were brainstorming the series with Marlon and his group, we really know that this is a conversation that will not happen in one day or in one session, not even if it's a 3-hour webinar, although I don't recommend that for anyone to sit down for 3 hours. But even if we were all that committed, that dedicated, that we will not be able to exhaust all the discussions that need to take place when we talk about energy transition. And even in the Philippine context, even if we don't talk about energy transition, if we talk purely about pushing for more renewable energy, knowing that that's where we came from. Renewable energy has been our base in the Philippines for several decades before non-renewable energy power sources came in the 1980s. Our system has been powered by renewable energy. But this conversation is not going to, as I mentioned earlier, is not going to take place in one sitting. So we talked about this as a series. And so last time, for the opening of the series, we talked to the renewable energy developers with I think Marlon already mentioned with Ayala as part of the group, because they are very aggressive also with their RE targets. And we have, since then, I'd like to share with the group also that we have also submitted to the to the Department of Energy our proposed 2021 to 2040 National Renewable Energy Program. And in that program, if you were able to join us during the Energy Investment Forum hosted by the DOE, we shared some details on the targets, including what Marlon had said earlier, our proposal to hard code, meaning part of the plans for the next 20 years will be meeting a particular target, and no longer as an aspirational target, but as an imperative. And I'd like to emphasize this because we have, since 2010, I think we have had 35% RE by 2030 as an aspirational target. We wish we would get there. But 10 years down the road, we have seen that not only have we moved farther from the target, we've actually moved more than 10% less than when we started off before the Renewable Energy Act in 2008, where we started with already 34% RE. As of last year, we were down to 20%, and I think the numbers are the same for 2020. I was in a session with the market operator, and it looks like we're close to the end of 2020, and we'll land on the same, almost on the same path of 20% RE, in spite of the lockdown, and the effect of the lockdown on our system. So how do we realize the numbers, the potential of the Philippines for renewable energy? The cost aspect we discussed last time, and that's what Marlon had shared with you. And maybe I can also share with you, I was looking at Marlon's numbers on the blended generation rate of Meralco as of Q4 2019. But I think on the national level, the numbers are actually higher. The blended generation rate is actually at 5 pesos 45 centavos. And we presented in the presentation for the proposed National Renewable Energy Program that if we adopt that 35% RE by 2030 as an imperative, increasing our RPS requirements to meet that target, we will actually have an LC. What the numbers show, what the model had shown, is that we will have an LCOE of just 3 pesos 18 centavos. That's the numbers, and that is clearly showing how competitive RE already is at this point in time, and that's where we want to go. It's not to increase. I address there are some news articles, I think, that miscontextualize the numbers. We are not The presence of RE or the increase of RE in our system will actually lower the prices in the long term. That's what we're seeing. So how do we get them there? The main challenge so far has been and raised, and we experience this particularly acutely in some areas of the Philippines, is the readiness of the grids of the grid. How do we know that the grid is ready to accommodate all these RE? And one very significant step forward is this identification of competitive RE zones. And we really celebrate the issuance of this report, because it will guide not only the RE developers but also the policymakers and the regulator in terms of what to prioritize and where to prioritize. So with that, I hope and I invite everyone to please raise your question, share with us your insights, because this is going to be a collaborative effort. We really want solutions to be, and path forward to be designed, to be developed collaboratively. So we welcome your inputs. With that, I guess I turn over again to Marlon, and thank you again for joining us. And I hope you sit back, not just sit back, but maybe participate also, and actively join us for this very interesting morning. Thank you again, and thank you again to our friends from NREL. Thank you, Marlon.
Oh, thank you, Attorney Mona, for the welcome remarks and leading the country's movement towards renewable energy and decarbonization. And as Attorney Mona said, just don't just sit back, participate. So the Q&A box is there for you to raise the questions that you may have. And next slide, please. We are joined today by two leading figures from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory who led the study on the Philippines' competitive renewable energy zones, Dr. Nate Lee and Dr. David Hurlbut. Dr. Nathan Lee is a researcher with the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and he is currently the technical lead for the USAID NREL Advanced Energy Partnership for Asia. His extensive international research portfolio centers on supporting energy strategy development in emerging economies. Dr. Nate, thank you for joining us. And alongside him is Dr. David J. Hurlbut, who is a senior analyst with the NREL's Strategic Energy Analysis Center. He specializes in wholesale market design and renewable energy policy. Dr. Hurlbut is currently advising energy officials in the Philippines, Colombia, and South Asia on grid-based strategies for increased use of renewables resources. Prior to joining the lab in January 2007, Dr. Hurlbut was a senior economist with the Texas Public Utilities Commission and oversaw the state's highly successful renewable portfolio standard, during which time Texas surpassed California as the state with the most installed wind capacity. He also developed the competitive renewable energy zone concept in Texas, which has since been used as a model for renewable energy transmission planning. Dr. Nate And Dr. David, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlon. And thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to present on the Philippines Competitive Renewable Energy Zones process. Let me get my screen up on the Zoom. So we really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you, Marlon. Thank you for those opening remarks, Attorney Mona Lisa. And thank you to all of our guests who will be presenting today. I think we see guests from NGCP and the Philippines DOE. And thank you to the organizers of this webinar. So we're really excited to talk a little bit about the Philippines Competitive Renewable Energy Zones process and its role in helping to accelerate the energy transition in the Philippines. Presenting today, I guess, will be my colleague David, and I'll hand it to him as well. But first, wanted to just note that the USAID and NREL have been partnered together with the Philippines DOE for at least a decade now, supporting energy sector activities in the country, starting with renewable energy data development and sharing through RE Data Explorer, as well as the recent Greening the Grid initiative, which really did identify all the potential for renewable energy in the existing Philippines grid. And we had the great opportunity to follow on that great work and build that relationship as well with the Philippines DOE and other energy family members in the Philippines for this work. So we're really appreciative of this opportunity. For our presentation today, I wanted to give a quick primer on the Philippines CREZ process for anybody who may not be so familiar with the CREZ process, and then hand it over to my colleague to really open up the discussion on developing these competitive renewable energy zones to support the energy transition in the Philippines. To start off my primer, I don't often do this, but this is such a great video, kind of highlighting the competitive renewable energy zone process in the Philippines and its role for RE development going into the future. So I thought I'd play this real quick, and then we can go a little bit deeper into the competitive renewable energy zones process.
For almost a decade, USAID and NREL have been partnering to bring best practices, tools, resources, and even technical assistance to our developing country partners, helping them scale up renewable energy and other advanced energy technologies.
During my college days, I've read a lot of papers from NREL, and it's a dream come true for me to be here at NREL, meeting the experts that have written those papers.
Currently, the Philippines is focusing on developing renewable energy because we want to achieve that self-reliance in terms of having those indigenous resources tapped and lessen our dependence in fossil fuels.
Ultimately, the CREZ process in the Philippines will inform their transmission development planning process and allow them to utilize the highest quality indigenous renewable energy resources in their country.
So basically, those CREZ will aid us in proactively planning transmission development for renewable energy in the Philippines.
So in the models, they looked at the transmission development plans that they already have underway. And then while they were here, we integrated the renewable energy zones with those transmission development plans. And so really seeing how the renewable energy growth would overlay with the transmission development that's planned, I think is probably one of the most valuable things, along with just working on the models themselves.
It was a real pleasure hosting such a fantastic group of modelers from the Philippines who were willing to give up 1 month of their time this summer to come and visit NREL's campus. It was a real technical exchange in that not only will we be supporting the CREZ process in the Philippines, but also learning a lot about the Philippines power system and their planning challenges.
So to me, it was really cool just to work with folks that actually operate power systems and have a real feeling for what something means on a certain line at a certain node in their system. The hope is, and I think their plan is, that this is really a jump start on integrating their models and using their models in the CREZ process. And so now that they've got this work underway, they'll be able to incrementally add to it, add new scenarios, update new scenarios based on new information, and hopefully that will be a relatively easy undertaking compared to what it would have been a month ago.
We were able to talk to a lot of experts and exchange ideas that we can bring home in our country, in the Philippines, and also share it with others in the field that we are in.
We hope to continue working with partners all across the globe to bring these practices to a wider audience and allow them to access the technical expertise within the DOE labs.
Okay. Hopefully the sound came through really well on that, but we were really excited to host some of the Philippines DOE modelers as well as NGCP as part of the CREZ process. So that video was just a quick overview of that technical exchange as well as the CREZ process. But as an overview of the Philippines CREZ process, it was launched by the DOE in 2018, as you may know, to help achieve the country's goals of scaling up RE in the power system and to ensure sustainable, secure, reliable, accessible, and affordable energy in the Philippines, many of the goals of your energy sector over the next decades. The vision was essentially to use transmission to direct RE development to places that optimize the use of indigenous or domestic resources and maximize the benefits to the people of the Philippines. So what is a CREZ? Again, a CREZ is a geographic area with really high concentrations of cost-effective RE that are suitable for development and have that strong private sector interest. The CREZ process is a proactive transmission planning process or approach that supports this investment in large-scale transmission expansion and upgrades and large-scale, so utility-scale RE development. And really helps to ensure the share of our RE can scale while we maintain these reliability and economics concerns. Again, the focus for the CREZ process here that we're talking about was really large scale, utility scale, wind and solar, so variable renewable energy, that when developed in really abundant quantities kind of warrant this transmission expansion. However, working with the DOE, we understand that all indigenous resources in the country are important, and all RE resources are considered in the CREZ process, even though they may not be considered the same in the process. So the CREZ are intended to be connected to the grid with new or enhanced transmission lines through this proactive planning process. The CREZ process was a stakeholder-driven planning process chaired by the Philippines DOE with the support from USAID and NREL. So I think when Marlon introduced us, he was very kind in saying that I led the CREZ process, or we were the leads of this report. But I have to hand that great honor to the Philippines DOE and the Undersecretary at the DOE for really leading and chairing the CREZ process and reporting activity. So here we can see that the CREZ process institutional structure with the Philippines DOE really initiated and leading the planning activity, a technical advisory committee, which many of you may have participated in, that was chaired by the Philippines DOE Undersecretary, with the participation of core energy sector institutions across the Philippines, and some ad hoc institutions to really provide the direction for this report so that it has ownership in the Philippines from the key actors. And then 2 working groups, one zone working group responsible really for the identification of study areas and zones with these high quality resources and private sector interest. And then a second generation and transmission modeling working group, really led by the DOE as well, that was responsible for that grid system modeling and analysis. So how do we connect those zones to the grid? So emphasis here is really that it's a stakeholder driven planning process chaired by the Philippines DOE. Quick overview of the process timeline and some of the modeling framework activities that supported this kind of transparent transmission development planning process. The process really began in 2018 with identifying what the process would look like, what would these steps be, who would be involved, and what's the real vision for the CREZ process. Why does the country want to undertake this proactive transmission planning process? And that really culminated with the department circular for the CREZ process, which you can find on the DOE's webpage, that was passed in 2018. Following that, we did start into step 2 of the process, so identifying those areas with really high quality RE resources and understanding through supply curves such as what are the costs and real quality of those resources in each of these zones. So working with the zone working group identified some of these really high quality zones and some private sector interest to then move into step 3, where we identified what the candidate zones would be. So where are the zones with the highest probability of interest? Where do developers see potential for really large quantities of utility scale wind and solar development? This leads into step 4. So kind of bundling those resources into what we call zones, which is essentially nodes where transmission could be interconnected to these utility scale resources. Often when we say zones, we think of a kind of an area that's constrained, but there are no borders to these zones. They're essentially areas where developers could find any high quality resources that really are feasible for development and that make financial sense to them. Followed by this, I think we, with step 4, published the report, which I'll share a link to later, Ready for Renewables, and shared this with the Philippines Department of Energy and NGCP, who are now work on a final transmission plan designation. So the typical transmission development planning process in the Philippines. So select some of those transmission options, and then into step 6, which is really that long process of upgrading transmission systems in the Philippines. So essentially, we're now at step 5, and on the left here, you can see a figure with the green circles across the entire Philippines, highlighting where these zones are following our report in the CREZ process. So around 25 zones across the entire Philippines, highlighting more than enough to reach the 20 gigawatt plus RE development goal by 2040, I think it was, that Marlon highlighted at the beginning of this, as well as some of the existing transmission level systems across the Philippines and some of the planned transmission expansion considerations within the NGCP's transmission development planning process. So essentially, as an output of the process, utility scale solar and wind was identified throughout the Philippines, and this is one map. You can visualize this and more data for wind and solar at the link below on RE Data Explorer for free. You can also download that data and visualize it with other data layers. But the 25 competitive renewable energy zones identified across the Philippines had an estimated total capacity of over 35 gigawatts of potential generation, so more than enough to find what's most feasible for developers and meet your Philippines goals or support those Philippines RE goals. And essentially, by area, we see over 10 megawatts or gigawatts of wind and solar in Luzon, as well as in the other systems of the Philippines. So high quality wind and solar. On the right here, you can see another map highlighting the 25 zones, as well as the solar resources in red that were identified throughout the Philippines. And we have a sister or a companion map to this in the report, which I can share, and you can download the data at the link below. Next steps in the CREZ process. Additional details about the CREZ process will be included in the next transmission development plan, which NGCP can speak more to, along with the Philippines Department of Energy. So NGCP will be exploring more transmission build-out scenarios that may increase variable RE shares based on the input from the CREZ process. And then this process will also be integrated into future planning activities, including the Transmission Development Plan, or TDP, and Philippines Energy Planning Process, or the PEP. This is just a screenshot of RE Data Explorer, again, where you can go and find some of this data on the different zones and high quality, high temporal and spatial resolution solar wind resource data that's completely for free, and you can download it if you're a developer or you're exploring any of this potential, as well as some of the information on how much wind or solar is available in a zone and what the actual cost could be for that. So the levelized cost of energy, which Marlon was talking about, that is really competitive for a lot of these resources throughout the Philippines. So that's my quick primer on what the CREZ process is. At the end of our presentation, there's a link to download the Ready for Renewables report. But right now, I'll hand it over to my colleague, David Hurlbut, who will talk a little bit more about where we go from now, or where the Philippines can go from now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. And thank you, Attorney Mona, and thank you, Marlon, for hosting Nate and I and talking about the CREZ process. You'll find that we love talking about it so much. Sometimes we talk about it too much, but there'll be time for you all to ask questions and to get feedback from you all. Nate has given you a very good background on what the CREZ process is and how we've gotten to where we are now. But I'd like to focus really closely on where to go from here. You know, I've been very, very impressed by the work that the DOE has done and that NGCP has done, and all the stakeholders participating in the CREZ process. The whole process has been very, very successful up to this point. In fact, I would say that the Philippines has taken this process, the CREZ process, further than most other countries in the world that have tried it. But it's not finished yet. The CREZ process in the Philippines has been successful up to this point, but it's not going to be finished until transmission is installed and energized. And for that to happen, it has to go from the planning process into the regulatory approval process. And for that to happen, NGCP needs to file an application for new transmission, and DOE needs to be able to endorse that renewable energy is a priority and that this transmission will make that renewable energy happen. That's all evidence-based, and that all takes place in the ERC review process. And very soon, that's where the CREZ process is going to be. The technical analysis has been done. The transmission planning is being done right now, but that's not going to be enough. And how this is important for NREB and for the developer community is that developer input is important to help prioritize the transmission projects that are in the approval process. It's something that DOE needs to see, that ERC needs to see, and that will help NGCP in integrating the necessary transmission in the right time order in order to get the best benefit from the transmission investments. So think of it as moving into a phase that is very evidence-based, because the ERC can't really sign off on anything just because it sounds like a good idea. They need to have evidence before them in the docket that they can cite that will support a decision to endorse the investment in specific new transmission. And that evidence can come in a number of ways. In the CREZ process itself, developer interest was measured primarily by the application of service contracts. How mature were filed service contracts that the DOE had before them, and how concentrated were those relative to the quality of the study zones, the study areas that we were looking at. There were some areas that fell off of the table in this process, even though they appeared to have really good resources, really good wind, really good solar. There were some that were removed because there just was very little evidence in the way of service contracts that suggested a strong developer interest. So I want to make sure that everyone understands the importance of real commercial interest. We can do a theoretical study. Anybody can do a theoretical study, but at some point, money is invested, capital is invested, and in order to reach those low LCOE numbers, there has to be these investments have to be done in places where the solar resources and the wind resources are abundant enough and of high enough quality that you can get the most megawatt hours per peso of capital investment. That's what this process is all about. Now, as I said, the CREZ process relied on service contracts. Going forward, as you get into the regulatory process, there are other types of evidence that will give great weight to transmission serving particular CREZs. For example, letters of credit or debt agreements, lending agreements with financial institutions, equity positions, options for the use of land and for leases. Anything that a developer has that shows evidence that there has been upfront money placed to develop renewable projects in these areas, that's something that would add great weight to the approval process and get that transmission in place faster. Because until that transmission is in place, all of the goals and all of the targets that the Philippines has will be very, very difficult to achieve. Because if you can't get the power to load, you're not going to get the results that you want. Another very important factor in looking at the weight and the speed of getting regulatory approval will be the types of renewable resources for which there is evidence of commercial interest. A CREZ that has multiple resources, that has wind and solar and biomass and geothermal and hydro, that combines a lot of resources, different types of resources into one transmission point, is going to be easier to manage because of the diversity of the resources. That diversity of resources will reduce the cost of integrating renewables in higher volume. So this is something to look for, and something for the developer community to think about as these transmission projects come to ERC for regulatory review. That's the point where they need to demonstrate not only interest for their particular project, but the fact that a zone is very robust because it has different types of technologies that have demonstrated and proven interest in connecting at that point. So that's something to follow, and we'll be hearing more in a little bit about how NGCP is integrating the the CREZ work into the transmission planning process. But I just wanted to emphasize that you're not there yet. You've done a lot of great work. The Philippines has done a lot of great work, but if it stops here, then all of that great work will be for nothing. And the LCOE targets that that Marlon was talking about earlier will be harder to achieve because those best, most productive wind and solar areas won't be accessible because of the lack of transmission. So at the end of the day, the mark of success is not only going to be a higher volume of renewable energy, but lower cost per megawatt hour produced, lower rates for end use customers, and lower cost of integration. And I can tell you that's how it worked out in Texas. When we started the CREZ process there, we really didn't have history behind us. We were looking forward, but we knew that the development that was taking place at that time wasn't very efficient. It was relatively high cost, and one of the reasons it was very expensive to customers was because of congestion and of resource quality that was not the best in the state. Since then, in the 10 years that have transpired since the completion of CREZ transmission, rates for retail customers have fallen by about 2 percentage points per year. The amount of renewable integrated into the ERCOT system has gone from around 10% to this year, it's going to be a total of 25% and will be much higher next year because of particularly the new solar and battery storage capacity coming online. But all of this has happened in an environment where costs have been coming down. They've been coming down because of access to high quality renewables and of efficiently integrating those renewables into the ERCOT grid. And so with that, I will stop talking and give it back to Marlon, and we can go into a discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Nate and David, for providing this primer on the Philippine CREZ process and supporting the energy transition of the Philippines. Actually, we've already gathered many interesting questions, and I also have questions on my own. But before we proceed with the open forum, we would just like to hear from one of the co-authors of the report from DOE, Engineer Nori Reyes, on his insights as Senior Science Research Specialist from the Power Planning and Development Division of the Electric Power Industry Management Bureau in developing the CREZ and previously conducting the Greening the Grid study. Engineer Nori, please be ready to turn on your mic as you share the challenges and the learnings in conducting this process and what you can share DOE's next steps would be, considering the next steps items that David has mentioned. But please share your insights first. Engineer Nori, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for that, Marlon. Good morning, everyone. Also, good evening to our colleagues in the US. I'm here to present this morning some insights on the experience that we had for the CREZ process, or the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones process. Maybe the main points were already highlighted by Nate and David. So my input for this morning will just be focused on some challenges, learnings, and what are the current activities being done by the Department of Energy related to this study or this activity. So maybe just to highlight some challenges that we encountered as we are doing this study. Maybe one is the introduction of this study to the Philippines was something that is we saw the value of it once this was proposed by the USAID in partnership with NREL to the Philippines DOE. The challenge for us then was how can we move or gather specific stakeholders that will allow us to achieve the goals set by the CREZ or the goals envisioned by the CREZ. So the initial list of stakeholders need to be involved and how to gather those stakeholders and align their respective activities in achieving the goals of the CREZ are very much important and at the same time challenging since each one has its own roles within the power sector. And maybe if you have browsed through the study, it started with us focusing first on JS data that somehow identifying sites and what will be the specific considerations for including or excluding certain areas within the grid. So JS data is very much important, and then weather data also in terms of assessing if that specific area really has a high quality of resource, maybe specific to various kinds of technologies or various RE technologies. So after that, the next process will be for us finalizing the identified zones and continuing the study for us to be able to identify specific transmission build outs or transmission options in order to tap those areas selected. So there is a heavy stakeholder involvement in this activity, and we're glad that we were able to push through with it. And we're glad that we have received a lot of inputs from various stakeholders within the energy sector. One problem also that or challenge that we encountered is more on data sharing. Maybe just to give you an idea, the first study that we conducted prior to this one is the Greening the Grid study for the Philippines. So the intention of the study is to first just to determine if we can accommodate high VRE penetration within the country. But the idea back then was to gather specific data, specific parameters to model the system adequately. So somehow it was a challenge because we experienced at least just to have that non-disclosure agreement signed 6 months for us to finalize that NDA before proceeding with the project. But but for this CREZ process, we need to have a workaround in that area. So that's why we have one of the ideas conceptualized was for us to specifically select modelers, go to NREL, and then from there finish the study. So from there, a lot of learnings were very much valuable that helped the CREZ process be not just a one-time activity, but a process that can be repeated, and be adopted here in the Philippines. So that's why.
Engineer Nori, is the since the publication of the report, has there been a continued work from the DOE side on implementing some of the recommendations as identified as well by David earlier? Is the work continuing since the publication of the report earlier this year?
Yes. So since the publication of the report, there has been a continuous study and also coordination with the various groups involved, specifically between DOE, NREB, NGCP, and also initial discussions with the ERC. So the idea, since it was included already in the Philippines Energy Plan 2018 to 2040, just to have an insight on what the CREZ process is, and also planning to be included in the Transition Development Plan of the NGCP. So the idea is to annually update and provide the stakeholders information related to the development of these CREZ areas. So as part of the DOE's next steps, we need to be able to discuss this thoroughly with the ERC for the approval of these transmission projects related to the CREZ. So that's all for me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer Nori. And we're also privileged to have Engineer Reddy Remorosa of the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines. Now that Engineer Nori is mentioning that we are now in the process of the transmission development plan, what are the anticipated challenges in adopting the CREZ for the TDP, and what will it take for uh, what it will take to the recommendations from the CREZ study. Engineer Reddy, any insights you can share?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Marlon. Thank you for inviting us today, and it's our pleasure to join you in this webinar. Yes, we have been part of the CREZ process, and we, as the transmission service provider, we fully recognize our very important role for the success of this CREZ process. And Nathan mentioned earlier that we are already on step 5 in the finalization of the transmission plan, or the lineup of projects. And presently, NGCP is um, preparing the TDP, or Transmission Development Plan 2021 to 2040. And we are set to conduct the public consultation for this TDP update come first quarter of next year. So we are highlighting there the projects that have been tagged as CREZ related. But one thing to note is that there are previous projects in the TDP already identified previously that will support the CREZ, the renewable energy zones. So those are not newly identified projects, but more like it's a reinforcement that those projects are really important. And David mentioned that the next step would be on the uh, regulatory approval. So the challenges, well, first it's on the prioritization. There are so many projects identified to support CREZ, which one we should do first. And that the next challenge is on the regulatory approval. David mentioned that um, we will need endorsement from the Department of Energy for those projects. And we would need discussions with DOE and ERC on how to proceed, because um, normally, or the existing regulatory process would be to support those power plants that have been committed already. But in this case, while we are trying to address the chicken and egg situation, we would want to have the transmission facilities in place, developed ahead, so that we can encourage the generation development. So that's something that we still need to have further discussion with the ERC and the DOE. And finally, the last challenge would be, after the project has been approved by the ERC, of course, the implementation, especially those that will require long transmission right of way. And those challenges are not new for CREZ related projects, but have been our concerns even for most of our transmission projects. It's not actually unique here in the Philippines. The right of way and the permitting and other project implementation concerns. So that's all for now, Marlon. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Engineer Reddy, and thank you to our speakers, Nate, David, Reddy, and Attorney Mona, and Engineer Nori. I have been reading through the questions, and then they are very interesting questions all. And I'm trying to lump them all in like a flow, so that we have a good flow of discussion. And first three questions will be, I'm just lumping them first. The first one is clarificatory questions, right, on the CREZ. Second one is on this challenge and regulatory approval, and how do we graduate from, because the CREZ was based on service contracts, which may not be sufficient evidence for real commercial interest, as David mentioned, right? How do we address this process? And maybe some lessons and learnings as well from Texas and the process, so that we could take in more RE to the system. So just first question, some clarificatory questions in terms for the overall grid design. And what is the CREZ transmission design framed in connecting it all to one whole national grid, rather than say building variable RE small island grids, for example, as a priority? Or is it like we're trying to make one backbone connect the rest of these CREZ zones? Can you please just clarify that in terms of overall design, Dr. Lee, Nate, or David?
Sure.
Let me,
David, if you want me to,
go.
I could take a first cut at it, and then I can hand it to you for that and the regulatory pieces there, if that works.
Sure.
Let me just share my screen. And the question, just in terms of scope of the CREZ process, is yes, it was focused at the utility scale level. The CREZ process was, but want to highlight here that the CREZ process is only one piece of many initiatives going on in the Philippines, and that the DOE and NGCP are working on, and others. So we don't want to say that we are prioritizing grid scale electricity over other types of electricity. I think they're all important. This was just one contribution. And this contribution is at the utility scale, so bulk resources connected to the national transmission system. That is not to say that there aren't resources and opportunities at many other different, or at other levels of the grid process. So just wanted to highlight that. And then can hand it to David.
Yeah.
Regulatory questions.
Right. Well, and also, to give you one story of how this played out in Texas. Yes, it was very definitely a whole grid approach, focusing on the transmission system. The immediate puzzle was, okay, how would we connect 10 gigawatts of renewables, variable renewables, and get to the best areas? Well, in the process of figuring that out, the grid operator was also able to solve a number of other grid-related problems that had nothing to do with wind and had nothing to do with solar. There was one particular, the way the existing transmission backbone was at the time, it formed kind of a crescent from the western part of the state to the eastern part and down through some of the urban areas. Well, that resulted in some voltage stability problems kind of at the tip of that crescent and in that void between the main paths of the grid backbone. Developing high voltage transmission to connect these renewable zones that you see in the left-hand map of Texas here, that also allowed the grid operator to essentially solve some of those voltage stability problems that were happening basically to the southeast of the central area that you see on the map here. And it relieved other congestion points across the grid, with the result that there was a general reduction in congestion-related prices that were due to the additional transmission that was being developed. So you can think of all the many different issues that you have to figure out in increasing the connectivity to Mindanao, for example. Okay, there are issues there that have nothing to do with renewables, but in the process of planning for higher development of wind and solar and geothermal and biomass and hydro on Mindanao, you can also solve a lot of the other congestion related issues that you'd encounter anyway in trying to increase connectivity to that island. So it's definitely a whole grid approach. If you try to break it out into different pieces, it gets very expensive very fast. Because building one transmission line to one set of renewable resources in one area, and in kind of a radial fashion, is not only very expensive, it's not very helpful to reliability. If you can have more connectivity rather than radial connections, it's a lot easier to maintain reliability and to integrate higher volumes of those resources. It's kind of a long answer, but I hope I hit the question here.
Yes, thanks, Nate and David. Attorney Mona, do you want to share some insights as well?
Actually, what I wanted to say was on your point earlier, Marlon, on the service contracts, because I see an alignment because we work closely with NORI in particular, and we also participated in some workshops with the NREL group. So for the NREP model, actually, what we did was, for the supply side, for the supply data for our model, we assumed that all the capacity that's covered by service contracts, actually, that were issued as of I think December 2019, we assume that they will be online, that they will be realized, so as part of the supply data in our model. So that's why when I opened the discussion earlier, I mentioned that what's key is for us to realize that capacity. Where they will come from is where the CREZ really matters. And I really like what David had said earlier about the work is not finished. The work is not done yet, because the next task is really where we need, and I like using this term for RE, where we need all hands on deck, because that's where the regulatory process comes in. Otherwise, as David had said, it's a beautiful report, but it's all that it is, and we don't want it to stop there. We want those projects realized. So as maybe I can just share also here, because ERC was supposed to join us. Engineer Galang from the regulatory office of the ERC was supposed to join us, but he was called in at the last minute. So one thing, we were chatting actually before the report, just on SMS, is that, because I was asking him when the TDP is done, ready steam, and everyone at NGCP has already finalized the TDP, submitted it to the DOE, and if all things go smoothly, DOE approves the TDP with the CREZ projects in line. How do we get the regulatory approval for all those projects? And Engineer Galang was just sharing with me the process, that it's still under the current rules, they still would require the generation project to be there in order to approve the project, which I think is what's leading to what we currently experience on the delay, on the congestion, and all that. And maybe I'd like to share also with the group at the NREB, when we had a dialogue with the ERC Chair Agnes de Venadera. She said that, and we highlighted to her some of the transmission issues, and the CREZ being, the potential that the CREZ can really offer for RE. She said that they're open to revisiting the rules and Engineer Galang also shared that earlier, that if we need to change the rules so that we can accommodate more RE or facilitate the approval of projects under the CREZ, then they are open to doing that. What's important is, and I like that David also highlighted this earlier, at the end of the day, what's important is that how do we make sure that this will not result on significant economic burden, right, for our consumers. We need to demonstrate, and when I say we, the RE community, everyone will have to demonstrate that this is the more economical way of doing it, and this will not result in inefficiencies, in increased costs that will not be, that could have been avoided by consumers, by every one of us. And I think we're there. We just need to put it together and really work collaboratively so that we can address the concerns, which I think are all our shared concerns anyway. But we'll get there, I think. So just wanted to share that point on ERC because they were not able to join us this morning.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Attorney
Marlon.
Mona, those are very good points. And I want to add a little bit more perspective here, kind of following up on something that I think Reddy mentioned earlier. So you're not going to have the projects in place before you review the transmission. That was the problem that we had in Texas, and that's what we had to solve. And the path forward was to sort of demonstrate evidence that the demand for renewables is going to be there.
Yep.
Okay. And this is where DOE has a very, very important role in the regulatory outcome. If there is national policy that says we are going to reach a goal of 30 gigawatts, which is more than what we have now, then that's a signal that there is going to be some demand occurring somewhere. If you don't do anything more with transmission, it's going to go to the best bad locations on the grid.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's going to cost everybody. What the CREZ process does is it doesn't create any demand. We have to be very, very clear about that. All these wonderful reports and everything, and this great stuff that NREB is doing, or that NGCP is doing, it's not going to create demand. But if DOE can present evidence to the ERC that demand is going to increase over the next 10 years, that more renewable demand is going to happen, then that can be a sound evidentiary basis for recognizing that there will be some demand, even though you don't have specific projects in front of you. It's a decision to use the transmission plan to send that demand to areas that will produce the most megawatt hours for every peso invested, and therefore reach those low LCOE levels that will benefit everybody. But it means thinking differently about establishing need. Is the transmission going to be used and useful? That's the term in the United States that we use. It's a different way of proving that and getting evidence before the ERC.
Absolutely agree with you, David, that thinking differently is what we need to get to a different ending, because we know the path where we are headed, knowing our current thinking. So maybe thinking differently will get us to that future that we want. Thank you.
And now that we have questions from the chat box, and
very good questions.
Very good questions, and we will try to answer them as much as we can, and then some clarificatory questions. But since we're in this middle of, we're clear on the path, we really just need to do the concrete steps. What do we have to do tomorrow, next week, to make sure that the chicken and egg situation is broken? Is this where, Attorney Mona, the RE auctions should come in? Because if we already have the CREZ areas, 25 of them, and we are looking at a 35% target for the decade, should we? Our available policy mechanism to demonstrate demand, to create the evidence that there is definite commercial interest and not just the service contract level, can we use the RE auctions as our primary tool, or even as a tool that we can use Q1, H1 next year to do this? What are your thoughts?
Definitely, I think, and there's already that consciousness in the Green Energy Auction Committee has actually convened 2 weeks ago, first meeting of the committee to set out the work plan for the first auction scheduled by June 2021. So, and this is the CREZ actually plays a big role for the, not just for the capacity, but definitely for the location of what to consider the location of the projects that will be part of the auction. And in fact, when we and then separately after the Green Energy Auction Committee meeting, we met with the secretary, and he's thinking of increasing the capacity, because we saw the numbers in CREZ, very good numbers, very high numbers on the capacity, on the resource, on the potential resource. So he said maybe there's room to increase that capacity, and to support maybe what David was saying earlier on the demand. DOE definitely has and Nori is here. Maybe he can add to this also. DOE has the numbers on the demand projections, and I'm confident we can support a petition with ERC for the approval, because the numbers also are there.
Okay, I'm eager to hear from Engineer Nori, but also another question. It seems that the CREZ report is highlighting solar and wind, but do we have further insights as well from the other RE technologies like geothermal, hydro, biomass? Some statements there, Nate or David?
Sure, Marlon. I think that's a great question, and we did include all renewables, all indigenous resources in the Philippines in our consideration. So it doesn't only consider wind and solar. I think in driving towards these zones, we used wind and solar resources as those bulk resources which may warrant kind of transmission development out to these certain zones that may be far from existing grid or far from existing load centers where a lot of the grid exists. Within each of those zones, we also identified with the Philippines DOE what geothermal resources exist, what hydropower resources, and what biomass resources may exist to the best of our ability. So each of the zones also includes any of those resources and their potential cost for development. And these were identified by the zone working group and approved by the TAC. So it does consider those. However, I would say that the focus was on identifying the zones for wind and solar as these are those bulk resources that we want to get onto the grid, whereas to meet this demand, as David and the Attorney Mona Lisa are saying, for renewables. And some of these other resources, such as geothermal, biomass, hydropower, could play an additional role in zone development, such as adding some dispatchable resources to the grid, or kind of meeting more localized demand, because biomass is potentially not going to be developed at the same resource quantity level that large scale wind and solar could be in these zones. So it may be helping to address some stability issues at local areas or meet local demand, but not so much for that bulk resource that we want to get onto the grid. But all of them were considered.
Yeah, and a couple of points to add to that. Remember that we're talking about bulk transmission development here, say a 400 kV line. So if you're going to have that big of an investment, you want to make darn sure that it'll get filled as much as possible. So, and in order to do that, you have to go for your bulk resources. You have to look at what is available, not only just to connect, but to connect in volumes to make sure that that transmission line is highly utilized. Secondly, the last thing you want to do is to treat all resources the same when they're not the same. Okay, so the characteristics of wind are different from the characteristics of solar, are different from the characteristics of biomass, are different from the characteristics of geothermal. So good planning, and what you try to do in the CREZ process is to bring all of those resources in ways that sort of play to the strengths of each of those resources. For wind and solar, their strengths are their volume. Their weaknesses have to do with their intermittency. But if you can bring other resources like geothermal, like biomass, or like hydro that are more controllable, then that brings those resources in playing to their strengths. So it's very important. I mean, it's very important to bring everything in the right way. Now, the reason there's so much focus on the planning for and the simulation for wind and solar is that because they're variable, they are very weather dependent, so and very terrain dependent. So analyzing where you get the highest volume per peso investment, you have to do a lot more analysis of the wind resources and solar resources, and they vary much more across the terrain. So there's just more data involved in those resources. That doesn't mean that they're more important. It means that they have different characteristics and a different role in the CREZ process.
Yeah, very good input, David. Like your quote on everything in the right way. It addresses, I think, many questions on the chat room as well about does this mean that RE can address baseload supply, given their intermittency and variability. But as you mentioned, it's really a combination of things playing to the different strengths, but also the weaknesses of each technology. Is that correct, David? We are really looking at the optimal combination of technologies to deliver the least cost to the consumer. Am I correct in synthesizing that statement?
Yes, and it's going to look a whole lot different than grid operations looks right now. I mean, NGCP is going to have a lot of interesting years ahead. If you look at the daily profile in ERCOT right now, okay, what used to be baseload has shrunk to about maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of what it used to be. It still looks like baseload, meaning that it's flat for a whole 24-hour period, but it's shrunk quite a bit. What's replaced it in that upper part of the dispatch stack is a lot of smart management, load forecasting, wind forecasting, solar forecasting, using other resources, dispatchable resources to sort of balance the differences between forecasted wind, forecasted solar, and forecasted load. You use your variable resources to fill in those gaps. Well, that's not how it was done 20 years ago, but it is how it's going to be done 10 years from now. And that's what this process is going to help make easier and less expensive.
And David and Marlon, I would just add to what David said earlier about each of these technologies have different values within a zone, but also highlight they also have values. All these zones have values in terms of just geographic diversity across the Philippines. I think earlier, I can share this screen as well. Earlier, we're looking at Texas, and that these zones were spread out over a large area of Western Texas and these wind resources. And as David said, the weather changes, and the weather doesn't always look the same in all of these locations. And so I think this is a slide that David put together. I think this is from one day in early 2018 for ERCOT's grid, kind of highlighting this CREZ geographic diversity, kind of helping some of this RE stability. And I see a lot of questions in the chat about concerns about this variability. So what this graph shows is the demand in megawatts.
Nate, can you share your screen, because we're interested to see it.
Oh, I think I forgot to hit the last button. So let me just go back 1 second. Just highlighting the wind resources that were connected by the Texas CREZ in Western Texas. had some geographic diversity, just like the CREZs here in the Philippines will have across the entire Philippines at the national scale. And this graph from early 2018, I believe, for ERCOT, we could probably update this now, but showed the megawatt demand or load on the system at each hour. So this is, I think, across 24 hours. And the installed wind capacity was around 21, 22 gigawatts. But the actual integrated wind output, so this diverse assemblage of wind that they're, as David said, kind of smart monitoring and dispatching or utilizing, is quite stable across the entire system. Whereas each wind turbine or small location, as our commenters are probably imagining, what would be very variable and intermittent. But the system as a whole, combining all this diversity of wind, and here in the Philippines, this may be solar and wind and geothermal and biomass and hydropower across all the zones, could add a lot of stability and other value to the grid.
Yeah, a very
Nate, let me see-
insightful.
Let me
Go ahead,
see if I
David.
can share a chart here that kind of shows more resources in it. Nate, let me see if I can share my screen here. Share screen. Want that one.
Yeah.
So hopefully
These
that
are
answers a lot of the variability questions you see there, Marlon.
Yes, yeah. One of those are the graphs that we want to see here in the Philippines, because you guys have done it, and then I'll ask David later some questions over the 10 years experience and learnings in Texas. And there's also a question about in the chat box about the multi-technology approach for CREZ. But go ahead, share your screen, David.
Okay. Well, I think I need to try it again.
It was showing earlier.
Maybe while we're waiting for David's slides, there was a clarification also in the chat, and maybe good to address this now, because I think it will be quick to address it. How the CREZ has actually, and if the CREZ has already taken into account the requirements for ancillary services in its current version. Maybe Nori or Nate can answer that point.
I can hand it to Nori and Reddy to answer, but the CREZ process was, until step 5, which Reddy highlighted we're on now, was identifying these transmission expansion options. So some production cost modeling to identify the least cost options and the cost of operating the system compared to others. And now any of these CREZ process activities, as Reddy noted, will go through the standard transmission development planning process that will include any required stability analysis or other grid analyses required. Is that correct, Reddy?
Reddy or Nori, any further insights? Please unmute yourselves.
Hi, Marlon. Yes, just to add to what Nate has mentioned. So in terms of the pool of capacities that will be able to contribute to the system flexibility and also contribute to the needed reserves of the system, it was already taken into account in the simulations conducted for the CREZ process. And also to just re-echo what Nate has mentioned, that after considering technologies that will aid system flexibility and also will provide the ancillary services needed by the grid, this will be still subject to various studies for voltage or stability studies that will be conducted by NGCP in terms of its transmission planning, in providing transmission planning options.
Okay, Engineer Reddy, any further statements or?
Yes, that's correct. It's not yet the end. Even if we have the major transmission backbone included in the TDP 2021 to 2040, It will not stop there. We will have the annual update of the transmission development plan, and even on the specific locations of the new substations to be built, to collect the RE resources um, that we still need. That will be for further updates in the succeeding TDP exercise. And yes, as regards generation, we will have more discussions on the required flexible generation to fully support our CREZ. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Freddy and Engineer Nori. David, are you ready to share the quick slides?
Yes, yes. I think everyone can, hopefully everyone can see the chart that I've got here.
Yeah, it's
Not
not
yet.
showing
Not yet.
it's not showing the chart. It's showing a different document.
Okay. Let's see here.
Yeah. Yeah, but while we're waiting for that, we also want to ask NGCP about, do we the process of mobilizing the capital to upgrade the transmission grid to accommodate the higher penetration of solar or wind power generation. As mentioned earlier, am I correct that this is where the ERC and the TDP process comes in, Engineer Ready, in order for us to mobilize the capital needed to upgrade should we need so to accommodate these new RE coming in?
Yes, that is correct. That's something that we will need to further discuss with the regulator, given the present regulatory framework being applied to the transmission operation.
Okay. And Attorney Mona, there are also questions about land, because the CREZ would approach will require, land to be acquired. Are we looking at ways to facilitate this process, acquiring land or right of ways? Is this covered by the CREZ, or will this be a different mechanism that we have already in place, such as the
I think the
EVOS?
CREZ, I typed in some answers to that question earlier, but the CREZ does not include those that aspect of transmission development. It's identify the areas with the resource and the transmission requirements that would be needed to realize the potential of those areas. But in terms of the other challenges like regulatory legal challenges, it's not part of the CREZ anymore. But what the CREZ allows us is because it's a proactive planning tool. If we have already identified the areas, then maybe the work that would normally be undertaken only after the areas have been identified by the generator, then maybe advanced work can already be undertaken, and a more deliberate design in terms of land acquisition, permits acquisition can be undertaken, and can also be, in fact, supported by the Department of Energy, and not just maybe a sole undertaking of the developer. Because if DOE is going to promote certain zones as ready for RE, then DOE in collaboration, and this is part of our 2021-2040 NREP, that if DOE can have arrangements already, memorandum of agreement, some joint framework with other related agencies like the Department of Agrarian Reform, because we know that land conversion is one of the main challenges for RE development, or for power plant development in particular, then maybe that can already be addressed by an agency to agency arrangement on how to facilitate these processes for RE projects. And also, if right of way is an issue, then maybe if the areas are pre-identified, then the rights of way can already be, the due process requirements for rights of way can already be undertaken ahead of time. That's why planning is really important. I know sometimes we take it for granted, especially when when we are faced with this situation, when conditions change very quickly, planning is still very important because it allows us at least to anticipate those that we can anticipate and address it, so that what the surprises are limited, so to speak, to those that we cannot predict.
Yes, I know we are already on top of the hour, but we'll just ask 5 more minutes from you guys. We have such an exciting, dynamic
I know
discussion.
David was correct earlier when he said, when we start talking about this topic, it's very hard to stop. So
Yes. And David, are you gonna share slides, or we can just skip it and we can just relay it to the participants later?
Let me try one more time, and if it doesn't work, we'll just move on.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. While you're doing that, please be aware that there's also a question like, can you elaborate more on that on Texas in the 10 years that you have experienced? You said that the retail rates have been decreasing 2% per year, and that penetration has increased from 10% to 25% within that 10 years. It's something of a future that we'd like to have, and has like a combination of technologies been part of that as well. So, but please feel free to describe this model first, this graph, and then answer those questions.
Okay. First of all, can you see the graph?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
yes,
Yay.
yes.
Okay. So let me take you through this quickly first, and I'll come back to kind of the how things unfolded in Texas. This is a sample day from last August. It was a high load day. You can see here down here, the bottom yellow strip is nuclear, the black is coal, and you can see that the operation of coal sort of fluctuated throughout the day. It started very low, mostly responsive to prices, and then rose to kind of a normal baseload level. But you look at the gap between the combination of coal and nuclear and the true baseload position, which is up here around 45,000 megawatts. That's a huge gap. And what's going on between here and here is the really interesting story of not only what's happening in ERCOT as a response to having more renewables through the CREZ process, but how it has affected prices. So this area here is wind, the yellow slice is solar, and these two orange slices here are natural gas. This is combined cycle, which is operated more as base load, and this is your combustion turbines that are really more load following resources. So you see that your load following resources are used mainly to adapt to the difference between wind, solar, and net load, and then what you've got already covered by coal and nuclear. So it's operating more flexibly throughout the 24-hour period. So that's the big difference. It's not, you set your base load on automatic and you go and get some breakfast and come back in a couple hours and it's all doing the same thing and you hope things don't blow up in the meantime. This involves a lot more hour by hour, 5 minute by 5 minute adaptation to load your variable resources and your flexible resources.
And in terms of the economics of this, I mean, this change in the profile, David, you said that this has caused the retail rates to decrease like 2% per year, right? That this has given consumers like relief in terms of like the cost of the electricity, correct?
Right, and it's a complicated story, many pieces to it, but a number of things are behind it. First of all, the CREZ transmission added about $7 billion to the capital cost. Okay, so that had to be paid for. And that went into the transmission rates that everyone paid. But as a result, not only did you have more wind coming onto the system, you had wind coming in from places that had capacity factors of like 50%, 55%, very high annual capacity factors. So a lot of megawatts coming from that invested capital. So that came onto the system. That pushed the most expensive thermal generator off of the supply curve, okay? So your expensive coal, your expensive natural gas, because you had more wind and now more solar on the lower part of the supply curve, it basically, pushed the expensive resources off. That resulted in a reduction in LMPs on average because of the configuration of the supply stack. Okay, so you had that cost reduction offsetting the increase in cost resulting from the additional transmission from the CREZ process. Now, at the same time, in the United States, we were experiencing some very low natural gas prices. So even those thermal resources at the end of the supply curve, even those resources themselves were becoming less expensive. So you had low gas prices, high renewable additions, offsetting the cost of transmission from CREZ, and the result of that, adjusted for inflation, was a reduction in total cost to customers.
Yes, I think this is the merit order effect that we've been hearing, and then we need to really digest that and use these case examples from what you've seen in places like Texas, in Hawaii, in other countries. And unfortunately, Attorney Mona, we're running out of time yet again. But the beautiful design of this webinar series is that this is a series and enabling the energy transition in the Philippines. We have many questions in the chat box. We'll try to answer them offline, okay? We always have this post-event, post-webinar emails to you with takeaways, quotes, and the recording. And we'll take some of those questions, collate them, group them so that we can have, we will be able to address them to you stakeholders. So it's unfortunate that we're really, even with the additional time, we still can't cover everything. But I think the key takeaways from this webinar is that really this is all about, as Attorney Mona mentioned, proactive planning. This is all about smart monitoring, load forecasting. This is a way for us to start that process because we want a future or a near future where we have lower rates. That's our biggest goal. Lower rates while decarbonizing, lower rates while achieving the 35% goal. And that's where we are right now in terms of the economics. And it's really, the story here is that lower cost of integration means lower cost per megawatt hour megawatt invested, means lower cost again per kilowatt hour to the consumers. That's why we are all in this together in this conversation. We would like to continue this partnership with National Renewable Energy Board to facilitate these conversations moving to the next year. And in the meantime, I would really like to thank our partner, the National Renewable Energy Board, chaired by Attorney Mona, for giving us a privilege to co-host this with you. To Dr. David Hurlbut, to Dr. Nathan Lee, to Engineer Nori Reyes, Engineer Reddy Remorosa, for your insights and lessons shared today. And we would like to acknowledge the invaluable support of the NREB Technical TechSec team, headed by Sir June Escobar, and includes Ma'am Cherry Hulongbayan, Gail Betara, Angelica de los Santos, Michael John Domingo, and Jorik Alimon. If you wish, Gabs, can you share the slide? If you wish to contact me and continue the conversation, I can be reached via LinkedIn, Marlon Apanada, and the email indicated here. So on behalf of the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator and the National Renewable Energy Board, the US NREL, Alutro Partners, and the World Resources Institute, alongside our partners for this webinar, the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines and the Philippine Department of Energy, thank you very much for joining us today and for being our continuing partners in this very timely, urgent, and important conversation on enabling the Philippine energy transition. We're all in this together. We will just break for Christmas. So maligayang Pasko at manigong bagong taon sa lahat, but we will continue these conversations in the next year. In the meantime, thank you very much and have a good day ahead. Maraming
Thank you,
salamat.
everyone.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.